Thanks again, Professor Arnold, for your presentation. It was very informative and great. Our next speaker will be Professor Melinda Benson, who is going to be presenting from an ecological perspective. She's a law graduate from the University of Idaho. She's an assistant professor in the departments of geography and environmental studies at the University of New Mexico. Her research and teaching focus on environmental and natural resource management challenges with a particular emphasis on trends in environmental governance, including resilience thinking and adaptive management, which means that she has the background to be presenting today, and she's going to give us a very informative presentation. And her work has been published in numerous journals. Prior to her academic life, she worked as a lobbyist and then as an attorney representing environmental organizations in the environment in the Intermountain West. Please join me in welcoming Professor Melinda Benson.
Thank you, Arsenio. I am really delighted to be here and be a part of such a really important conversation about new trends in environmental law and new trajectories. You know, like a lot of you, I've been watching a lot of Olympics lately, and one thing that really strikes me is that these athletes are constantly, absolutely at the edge of what they're capable of. You know, so you have these snowboarders who are doing these crazy tricks and then landing in the middle, of the pipe, or these cross-country skiers who are, dropping from exhaustion after a race. And I think it's fair to say that when it comes to environmental challenges, as a society, we are nowhere near close to reaching our potential. And so why is that? What does it mean to be adaptive and resilient? Part of what I'm going to be talking about today is that how we conceptualize and think about these challenges really matters. So I'm going to be framing those in a sense of narrative, stories that we tend to tell about social ecological relations, as I call it. Resilience is really becoming the new IT term when it comes to environmental management. And so part of what I want to examine here also is whether is this just a buzzword, or is this really a new way of conceptualizing environmental challenges? And if it is, what are the implications of that? So before getting to resilience, there are two other narratives that I want to examine. What I'm calling the crisis narrative and the sustainability narrative, and how they're reflected in our laws and policies. And of course, all of these narratives sort of overlap, but I'm going to be sort of situating them historically and making the argument that each of these other narratives, crisis and sustainability, sort of had their heyday, and that this concept of resilience is really on the rise. Each narrative has a different story about the role of knowledge and science specifically, and how it deals with scientific uncertainty. And I'm really grateful to Tony for providing a lot of background on resilience thinking or resilience theory, and we're going to be building upon that. By looking at these as narratives or sort of stories we tell, how we conceptualize, we can look at some of the underlying assumptions associated with each of them, and perhaps make some more transparent decisions about how we want to orient towards these challenges. So part of the argument that I'm going to be making is that while sustainability and resilience are often kind of used interchangeably as concepts, that resilience might be a more productive way of thinking about environmental challenges, and that the concept of sustainability has reached its end. So, in talking about the crisis narrative, or it's a fear-based vulnerability narrative, I think it's fair to say that this narrative really was born sort of post-World War II, and there are, of course, a number of events that I could point to that are part of our story along these lines, but I'm only going to be talking about three of them. One is Rachel Carson's publishing of Silent Spring in 1962. So it was a beautifully written and scientifically driven examination of the impact of pesticides, in particular DDT, on birds and other wildlife. She's often referred to as the mother of the environmental movement, and this is why. She showed us sort of the darker side of better living through chemistry. And she raised the alarm about the possible impacts of pesticides and other substances. The second event that is often associated with this narrative, many of you probably recognize it, the photo called Earthrise, which was taken by the Apollo 8 crew in 1968, showing us for the first time the Earth as it appears from deep space. This is an iconic image of both our isolation and the delicate fragility of our planet. And like Silent Spring, it's often given credit for helping to launch the environmental movement of the 1970s. The last event that I'm going to talk about came in 1969, when the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland, Ohio caught on fire. It drew national attention to water quality and other environmental problems, not just in Ohio, but across the nation. This fire burned for about 30 minutes and caused about $50,000 worth of damage. But interestingly, this was not the first time that this river had caught on fire. It had actually caught fire several times between the 1860 and in the 1950s. And in fact, the 1952 fire lasted for days and caused $1.5 million in damage, which goes to show that, in a sense, timing is everything in terms of the meaning that we tend to establish to any individual event as these narratives unfold. So all of these events, Carson's book, this photograph, Silent Spring, Earth Day, we could name others, occurred during a time when Americans had what Schellenberger and Nordhaus argue like an unparalleled sense of both optimism and prosperity, in terms of a belief in our capacity to really take on these challenges and make the world a better place, and a lot of faith in the ability of science and technology to do this and to accomplish that. So these events ushered in what I'm calling the Polyester Era of environmental law, the regulatory era of the 1970s, and Tony's done a nice job of kind of summarizing some of those characteristics. I'm going to emphasize a couple as well. So along with our increased capacity to both understand and respond to environmental challenges, we ushered in this era and a number of regulatory statutes, National Environmental Policy Act, Endangered Species Act, Toxic Substance Control Act, that are ambitious and prescriptive, and they tend to have a number of characteristics, all of which are sort of based on science and technology. So first, they tend to be media specific, meaning they tend to talk about or try and control water or air, waste. They tend to be jurisdictionally bound in the sense that they rely on traditional scales of governance, usually federal mandates with state implementation. They tend to be framed around the assessment of risk and the capacities of technology, and as Tony emphasized, they tend to be command and control. They're prescriptive regulation, actual mandates to require and make change. So I call this the Polyester Era in the sense to say, sure, it was a miracle fabric for its time, but do you really want to be wearing it now, right? Most of what we have today on the books are these laws from the 1970s, and while we have had some changes, most probably notably the Clean Air Act amendments in the 1990s, for the most part, they're still operating as they have for decades. And it is important to acknowledge that there have been major successes, particularly in the context of water and air pollution. So in some ways, you could think of it as these are the types of laws that have been good at addressing sort of the low-hanging fruit of environmental problems, specific targeted problems, end-of-pipe problems, using what I would argue is this recipe of fear plus science equals some sort of change. But I think that this argument has really taken us as far as it can, in part because that discourse ends here. If there's not something to be afraid about, what are our motives for taking on change? The reality is that the sense of prosperity and optimism to take on our challenges and fears is not what it once was. And nor is really our unquestioning validity in the role of government, to play a role in taking on these challenges. So even if it were, as Tony emphasized, these types of laws are just not all that well suited to deal with the next generation of environmental challenges. Global climate change, biodiversity loss, unprecedented rates of resource consumption, all of which are characterized by a lot of uncertainty and a lot of complexity. And on a deeper deeper level, this crisis narrative, I think, is really problematic because it tends to animate a belief that humans are a threat to and separate from nature, and that in some ways we're like this outside influence that is messing things up. So this crisis-based narrative is sort of based on a concept of separation, and I would say in some ways a narrative of shame. So we have these polar bears that are, you know, stranded on disappearing ice, and somehow this is our fault. Bill McKibben is, you know, I've got Bill McKibben in his Lorax pose here. He's perhaps one of the most influential environmentalists of our time. He's got an organization called 350.org, and he's really a quintessential example of this narrative employed in his book, The End of Nature, in which he argues that at the point at which human influence through climate change and other actions is felt everywhere, nature is nowhere, right? So in short, the crisis narrative, kind of casting environmental challenges as scary events that must be immediately addressed with science and technology, is just no longer working, and it's really run its course. So this is my last slide, trying to convince you kind of this idea. And I'll have to tell you the story behind this. This is how I came up with this idea of the polyester narrative. I was preparing a lecture on the National Environmental Policy Act. I was trying to find a photograph of President Nixon signing NEPA into law to just make the argument, you know, we used to have these Republicans that were really, you know, very supportive of the environment. And I was not able to find a photograph of that, but I did find this picture of President Nixon with Elvis. And, you know, this could be NEPA that they're looking at. More likely it's a photographed, you know, picture of Elvis himself. And this is, you know, to be fair, probably velvet and not polyester. But I think you get my point. We can do better. So moving on to the sustainability narrative, which refers to the long-term ability to continue to engage in a particular activity, process, or use of natural resources. And to some extent, this narrative also started to take some hold in the 1970s, especially with our natural resource statutes and sort of multiple use sustained yield as a mandate. And the UN starts to use this concept around that time. But I would argue that this is a narrative that really takes hold in the 1990s, when the international community embraced sustainable development at the 1992 Conference on Environment and Development at Rio, incorporating it both into the Rio Declaration and Agenda 21 at what is now called the Earth Summit. This was the same conference that, in which the world really took on global climate change and opened for signature the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So it's sort of interesting to note that the narrative of sustainability really has been born and occurred during a climate change era. This three-legged stool that I think Tony kind of invoked this concept is often used as one of the sort of symbols of sustainability. And I think it's helpful here because it does kind of point to some of the underlying assumptions associated with sustainability that are important to examine. The sustainability narrative has sort of embedded within it some underlying assumptions. One, that we know what can be sustained. The second is that we have some sort of capacity to hold on to some sort of stationarity or equilibrium. So we've got this sort of stable balance, right, built on these different three stools. And I would argue that this narrative has also really reached its limits, because the reality is that the pursuit of sustainable development goals has not resulted in the mitigation of climate change or addressing other pressing environmental problems. Greenhouse gas emissions have continued to rise, as have resource consumption patterns in terms of pace and scale, biodiversity loss at increasingly alarming rates. So a couple of years ago, the United Nations held what it called its Rio +20 conference. And this is another image that is often associated with this narrative, sort of these hands are holding the planet. You know, we're kind of holding it together. But I would argue we're not keeping it together. This is a quote from the executive director in anticipation of the Rio Plus 20 conference, they issued their Global Environmental Outlook report, which he summarized as saying, if current patterns of production and consumption of natural resources prevail and cannot be reversed and decoupled, then governance will preside over unprecedented levels of damage and degradation. And the report really emphasized the increasing likelihood of what we call nonlinear and rapid change, sort of these shifting of thresholds and moving into different system states, as we would call it in resilience theory. And yet, despite all this, we all tend to still be embracing this concept of sustainability. This discourse has reached its end because we face a future where we no longer have the capacity we just need to admit that we don't know what we can sustain at this point. And so it's not that sustainability is a bad idea. The issue here is whether sustainability is a narrative that's really helpful as we begin to form new environmental governance goals. By definition, sustainability assumes that there is a desirable state of a socio-ecological system that we can maintain. But in practice, sustainable development goals have been difficult to realize even before climate change and related factors came onto the scene. In 2008, scientists published in Science magazine an article entitled Stationarity is Dead. Stationarity, as Tony mentioned, being this idea that systems tend to fluctuate within this certain envelope of variability, and that climate change and other types of human modifications have brought an end to stationarity. Then Robin Craig brought this into the legal context with the Harvard Environmental Law Review article, Stationarity is Dead, where she argues that we need to have policies that catch up with this idea. I was assigning this article in one of my seminars, and I ended up contacting Robin because I found myself asking the question, has anyone done anything with Robin's really great detailed argument about the need to move on and develop new ways of thinking? And her report was that it had gained some real interest in the academic realm, but no real policy orientations that she really knew about. So she and I cooked up a plan to take maybe a more ambitious approach, maybe a more radical approach. We said, let's just make an argument that we should just chuck the whole concept of sustainability altogether. And so we wrote an article called Replacing Sustainability. So I'm not going to belabor that here, but the main thesis presented is that sustainability goals are based on the assumption of stationarity, and that climate change has eliminated our ability to rely upon that concept. So we need a new paradigm to look at a world facing continual change. So, in order to meaningfully engage the realities of socio-ecological change, new policies and institutions need to be developed to accommodate uncertainty and anticipate nonlinear alterations to systems. So is resilience thinking the new narrative to take on this challenge? And if so, is it sufficiently different and to provide a more productive orientation to these challenges ahead? As I mentioned earlier, the concept of resilience and sustainability are often used interchangeably. And while they are not inherently incompatible concepts, they are not the same. So my definition here, similar to Tony's, the capacity of a system to absorb a spectrum of disturbance and reorganize, but still retain basically the same process, function, structure, in other words, the same identity. So while stationarity assumes that we know it can be sustained and we've got some sort of capacity to hold on to that stationarity, resilience thinking acknowledges disequilibrium and nonlinear change within systems. And from a governance perspective, this concept of adaptive capacity becomes really critical. So the dynamics and complexities of socio-ecological systems are embraced, certainty is not required, and the emphasis is on adaptive capacity rather than stationarity. So our ability to either resist or accommodate change. So this is an element of resilience thinking that really does sort of set it apart. This concept of transformational capacity. So where regime shifts occur, the emphasis is on transformation, defined as the system's capacity to reconceptualize and create a fundamentally sort of new system with different characteristics. So intentional transformation involves a conscious and deliberate negotiation from one system to another. And there are really kind of three elements to this idea. First, are you prepared for change as opposed to being in a state of denial? Are there options for change? Can you chart out new trajectories for the socio-ecological system? And then, importantly, from a governance perspective, capacity. Can you meaningfully make choices among the trajectories that you are anticipating? So, in this way, adaptive capacity serves a couple of different purposes. It's important whether or not you're trying to sort of keep a current system state in place, or whether you're trying to make some sort of meaningful and conscious transition, transformation from one system to another. So to use my own social ecological system of the American Southwest, I'm from Albuquerque, New Mexico. I've been there for 6 years and I love it, but it's a very interesting place to live right now. Ecological indicators and climate models are pointing to a regime change that is currently in motion, particularly with regard to our forest systems. Two of the most dominant sort of drivers within this are bark beetle, which are actually an endemic species, but because of warming temperatures, their capacity to change forest dynamics is altering dramatically, and also the increase in forest fire size and intensity. So beetle outbreaks cause large areas of upland forests to be susceptible to fire. And so then when combined with drought conditions that are currently gripping the Southwest, you create these sort of positive feedback loops between bark beetle outbreaks, forest dieback, and forest fires, leading to greater areas of forest mortality. This feedback loop is really threatening to just continue to get stronger as temperatures increase. So this is one of many papers coming out of the USGS, so the Geological Survey from our HEMAS research station. This paper pointing out that by 2050, the mean forest stress will exceed that of the most severe droughts of the past 1,000 years. So we are looking at some regime changes. These next few slides are from my colleague Cliff Don, who's in the biology department at New Mexico. This first is actually a view from his house of the Los Conchas fire in 2011. This was the largest fire in the state's history until the next year. So that's what we're seeing. A year later, the Whitewater Baldy Complex fire burned over 297,000 acres in New Mexico's Gila Wilderness. And in fact, this weekend, temperatures in Albuquerque are predicted to be 20 degrees above average temperatures, and they're already beginning to be concerned about fire risk in New Mexico. So a combination of drought, beetle infestation, and decades of fire suppression are creating what we're calling mega fires. Fires that burn with such intensity that they completely destroy all vegetation, including and soil microbes that are really important for regeneration. Forests are sort of our natural reservoirs, right? And also water treatment facilities, right? So we tend to, in the American West, store a lot of our water in snowpack, and these changes in these forest systems are going to make flooding challenges really different, water quality challenges really different, ecosystem services that we've kind of taken for granted that are no longer going to be provided. So fire, I like to tell my students, is sort of our natural disaster in the American Southwest. And it is going to transform the American West more generally. So following the characteristics of this sort of concept of transformative capacity, are we prepared for change as opposed to being in some sort of state of denial? I think it's fair to say that at least the scientists are really starting to come around to this idea, but the larger culture itself really doesn't have any sort of sense that our forest systems are changing and really disappearing. Do we have options for change? Can we choose among different trajectories for the system shift? So in this case, what types of vegetation successions do we want to have? Do we, the current nominees for these systems are scrub oak or aspens. So the third element, can we meaningfully change, make choices among these trajectories? If we want aspens, for example, that's my vote over scrub oak. I don't know how many of you are familiar with those two. Aspens are pretty, they're tall, they give you a nice shade, right? But if we want to have aspens, we're going to need to change our cattle and sheep grazing practices. We're going to have to address current overpopulations of elk because all of those species tend to browse on aspen seedlings and keep them from really regenerating. So I would argue that we're really at a critical juncture in terms of really integrating this concept of resilience into our actual structures of governance. The concept of resilience is gaining steam among natural resource managers and policymakers, but at its current stage of development, resilience really is in danger of becoming, like sustainability, more of a rhetorical device with little influence on actual decision making. Adaptive management is often sort of regarded as sort of the vehicle for putting integration of these concepts into practice. And as Tony mentioned, it's really happening for the most part at this sort of informal agency guidance sort of stage. So I have here the technical guide for the Department of Interior, in which they sort of encourage their agencies to engage in adaptive management when appropriate, right? But I would argue that adaptive management itself does not necessarily mean that the underlying theory of resilience is also being embraced. So it is, in a sense, just sort of being thrown like a blanket on top of existing narratives and policies and requirements. And while they offer sort of promise in terms of putting these ideas into practice, we really need to have these concepts integrated into our laws and policies in more enforceable ways. So we need basically a more deeply ingrained embrace of the concept of non-stationarity, which I think also sort of requires us to really sort of let go of some of these past narratives and move beyond them. So I think I agree with Tony in the sense that, to this extent, they're kind of like, they've been sort of cumulative, but how well does that really serve us when we're trying to make meaningful decisions sort of moving forward? So my conclusions sort of here are that we need to do a better job of integrating narratives into our laws and policies and be more intentional about the narratives that we are creating. The crisis narrative, this idea of assessing risk and then attempting to control and manage for it, has taken us as far as it can. It's just not well suited to deal with global climate change and other environmental challenges. Sustainability is a concept that maybe never was appropriate, but it's certainly not appropriate now given the end of stationarity. Sustainability sort of habitable discourse is one that we just can no longer afford to indulge. We have destabilized this concept of stationarity in science. Now we need to move on and start destabilizing that concept in our laws and policies. Resilience as a narrative does, I think, reorient us and provide more productive and more helpful ways of thinking about our relationship to natural systems and approaching global climate change and other challenges. And it takes an emphasis, I think, importantly, on understanding and coping with change, rather than increasingly futile efforts to try to hold on to some type of current state of being. So how we perceive and sort of understand and orient ourselves towards these challenges matters. And by examining sort of their underlying assumptions, my hope is that we can develop strategies that are necessary to meaningfully respond to our rapidly changing world. And I'm glad I have hopefully some time for questions because I think we had a great dialogue earlier after Tony's talk, so thank you. Yes?
I was reading one of your articles where you talked about applying the resilience theory to what the Forestry Act, and there's seem like, obviously there's a problem with actually administering it into a specific agency. But is it fair to say that, part of the problem would be interagency lines? Because it seems like every agency has their own, they're pinpointing a specific problem. But it seems to me, especially when you're talking about the water shortage, part of the deal is with, there's, at different agencies, all apply to the same thing. They're not really, it doesn't seem like.
They're siloed.
Yeah.
Right?
They're not,
Yeah.
Is there an easy solution to that?
Is there an easy solution to that? I think we need to get more bold and be willing to really point to those and really create new institutions and ideas. And water is a really great example. In the American West, most of our water allocation regimes follow something called the prior appropriation doctrine, which is basically a historically based allocation system. The people who got the water first get it first, and then you sort of move on down the line. That's an allocation system that made a lot of sense when we had no government in the American West and no ability to really make choices among resources. It makes absolutely no sense today, I would argue. But there's a real unwillingness to challenge that historically based orientation towards allocation. And there's also, as you sort of point out, sort of an unwillingness to create new institutions. There's some exceptions like in California, but institutions that really integrate both water quality and quantity. So for example, the city of Santa Fe had a really difficult time operating its drinking water supply this past summer because they had no water, but when they did have high amounts of water, it was because of flooding events, monsoonal rain systems. The water quality was so bad. There was so much sand and other sort of, the turbidity was such that operating the plant wasn't really that feasible, so the water quantity and the water quality problems were completely integrated. So yes, I think that we need to be willing to really fundamentally re-examine our current sort of alignments and our certain sort of strategies. Let go of the strategies and really embrace new ones. Yes?
You mentioned that stationarity is dead, and it's sort of hard to show that and illustrate that to other people, but you're also working within a geography department. Have you looked at working with your fellow professionals there and sort of doing a mashup where, with we're in the golden age of geospatial information right now, and where you can show that there are these changes and illustrate it and use that as a sales tool. Dying polar bears is one thing, but if you can show the climate change, morphine, and the other related impacts as a sales tool, you consider that?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So part of what you're pointing to is the new capacities in geographic information science to track land cover change. Really powerful tools. I think one thing that we're finding is that, in part because this wonderful information age that we live in, we really are, as a culture, are past the point at which we point to one individual event as sort of really tipping the scale and having us all think in a different way. Instead, as you were pointing out, we all kind of thought Katrina was going to be the story that would shift us into addressing climate change, for example. Well, what about what's going on, then Hurricane Sandy, right? But none of these individual sort of events or sort of scientific, IPCC reports, probably some of the most disappointing stories that we have out there, increasingly confident sort of conclusions being made by science, but the traction doesn't seem to be there. So I think it's absolutely necessary, but I think that as folks who are looking to embrace new strategies, there's not going to be one magic event. There's not going to be one magic tool. The chatter of the information age is such that we don't tend to make those sort of cultural shifts together in unison. If, like, we maybe, at least we tell ourselves the story that we used to do that in the past, right?
I really liked your talk about the resilience narrative. I think it's inherently more positive than the crisis narrative that we've been talking about. Most people respond better to resilience and positive narratives opposed to negative narratives. However, I think it kind of presupposes that people know that there is a crisis or that climate change is something that they need to be concerned about. And unless you're inherently an environmentalist, we need to be able to communicate with the average Joe or average Jane who is not an environmentalist and be like, climate change is real and it's having an effect on your life and will continue to have everybody need to, I guess, take ownership of this narrative?
Right, I mean, I think that's such an important point. I think that part of what I'm trying to put forward is that portraying climate change, I mean, I'm not going to say that climate change isn't a huge challenge. I mean, notice I use the word challenge, right, instead of environmental problems. Because Americans love a challenge, right? You know, we were talking about generational differences earlier. You know, the millennial generation, so each successive generation from boomers to Xers, I'm an Xer, to millennials is just decreasing in terms of concern, not just for environmental issues, but social issues more generally. Environmental issues, though, more specifically. And I think that one of the reasons why we haven't had more people kind of willing to sort of get beyond the state of denial, really, and address the issues of climate change are in part because this sort of shame-based narrative really tends to shut them down. They feel hopeless. That's my experience of my students. You know, so I teach at the undergraduate level a course called Nature and Society, and my students are so cynical. They're really cynical. They're very shut down. I mean, what we tend to find when we actually use polling around this type of crisis type of narrative is that it convinces people who are already convinced. You know, and people for whom they're not sure, they just keep flipping the channel, right? So I'm not here to say that climate change isn't a crisis. I'm saying packaging and oriented in that way tends to sort of stop the conversation rather than continue the conversation. So we need to find new ways of being willing to take these things on.
How does resilience avoid the problems that crisis narrative and sustainability narrative have of just dealing with the problem that people were aware of? It seems, for the example we gave with the fire in New Mexico, I'm sure that the people in that area are really focused on that, but how do you they're not the only ones causing the problem. So how do you get that resilience narrative to accomplish what maybe even the crisis and sustainability, once we're able to accomplish this, is getting more people on board with the solution?
Yeah, can it be a narrative that opens the conversation a little bit more broadly and that more people really actually enter into and sort of engage? Is it a better?
How does it avoid the same issues that have undermined the crisis and sustainability approaches to addressing environmental problems, which is they're only a problem for the person who's experiencing it directly, and everybody else is happy to keep doing what they've always been doing?
Yeah, I think one of the elements of resilience thinking that really helps with that, so I already talked about one element of how I would answer that, which is kind of getting past blame and shame as a way of orienting. But another way in which resilience thinking I think is helpful is that it embraces the complexity of what we call these kind of cross-scale dynamics. So part of the emphasis of resilience thinking is that it's not just one forest or one isolated event. Obviously, you know, we're talking about, in the American Southwest, climate adaptation. We're not talking about mitigation because sort of globally, we're a fraction of that problem and don't have a lot of big handles on that problem. Global climate change happens at a global scale, but it's felt at a local scale, right? So a part of, I think, what's helpful about resilience is it's good at connecting the threads of dynamics across different scale systems, something that we haven't had a chance to emphasize as much yet. But I think that part of what's possible is that in the reality is that in other parts of our lives, we embrace that kind of complexity all the time. You know, so you think about how we live in terms of our relationship to our phones now, as opposed to how we had our cars instead of 1970s, right? So we're embracing complexity, embracing change in other kind of parts of our lives. We still seem to kind of be stuck in these older ways of being oriented. I also kind of want to challenge a little bit this sort of idea that until everyone in our culture believes that climate change is real, we can't do anything. And until everyone agrees that we've got an environmental problem, we can't take on these challenges. That's really, you know, not how the culture has operated in many cases. You know, we had sort of faith and trust in science and government to make decisions and to make big policy, ambitious policy changes, not just in environmental context, but in other contexts. And so the popularity contest model associated with environmental change is not one that I think we should necessarily assume needs to happen.
One of the things I took away from your...
You're fine, so we'll be the last question.
Okay. From your talk is something you said early on is that, you know, coming out of the crisis narrative that came out of all the problems in the 60s and early 70s up through, you know, time speed here. I mean, okay, you get a what I think is almost pejoratively referred to as a command and control system, but I would rather think of it as a regulatory framework. You actually get something coming out of there that addresses problems. I mean, actually fixes problems. We don't have the Cuyahoga burning anymore. On the other hand, where and that has actually driven a lot of the adopted management approaches that have come after that. And a lot of the talk about sustainability has come as a result of, oh, gee, we want alternatives to this. But the fact is, those things have actually driven a lot of what's gone on. And where they've been lacking, for example, dealing with non-point source issues, other types of things, where those structures have been weak, we have not had a systematic change. We've had these problems that have continued to exist. How does your narrative overcome, how do you get to success? Are you saying we don't need regulatory frameworks in order to get there? Because it seems like we do. And if we need regulatory frameworks, how does resilience get us there as a narrative?
Yeah. I mean, I'm actually a big fan of regulatory frameworks. I'm a command and control girl, personally. I like enforceable requirements. I think that those can be really helpful in a lot of ways. And Robin Craig, in her book, in her article, Stationary is Dead, she points to sort of pathways. And one of the important pathways she talks about is that we need to keep in place a lot of the sort of strong environmental controls that we have. But your discussion about point sources and non-point sources points actually in some ways to one of the weaknesses associated with this sort of model, which is that we actually passed a lot of these laws when we did have a lot of faith in science and technology, a lot of sense of our ability to take on these challenges. But the sort of structures in which we sort of put them in place created dynamics or political dynamics that really put a cap on new and more ambitious types of challenges. So we've never really taken on non-point sources under the Clean Water Act, and we never are going to sort of take those challenges on. So I'm not here to say that we should get rid of all sort of rules and regulations necessarily. Part of what I'm trying to say is that our orientations about these problems sort of need to change. And part of the orientations to them is going to be the reality that, as Tony was talking about, water quality is a different question now than it was in 1970. We need to be looking at sort of the dynamics and complexities of these systems and sort of embracing those complexities and also figuring out ways to talk with both the regulated community and the environmental community that we need to be more ambitious in terms of thinking outside the box and beyond those traditional tools. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.